Imagine hearing the same airline call sign coming from two different aircraft at almost the same time. Now imagine those two aircraft are in the same area, talking to the same air traffic controller, and their flight paths are converging. That is exactly what happened near Phoenix on August 14, 2026, when two American Airlines aircraft were operating as Flight 2482. And what makes this incident especially interesting is that the aircraft did not simply share the same commercial flight number. They were actually using the same ATC call sign, American 2482. So how did two aircraft end up using the same call sign at the same time? And how close did this situation come to becoming something much more serious? Let's break down what happened. Under normal circumstances, there is nothing unusual about American Airlines using Flight 2482 in both directions. An aircraft can arrive as American 2482 and then operate the return flight as American 2482. The important assumption is that the two flights occur at different times, usually with the same aircraft performing the turnaround. But on August 14th, that assumption broke down. The inbound American Airlines flight was heavily delayed. Instead of waiting for that aircraft to complete the turn and operate the return flight, American used another Boeing 737-800 to operate the outbound service. And that created an unusual situation. The original Flight 2482 was still making its way toward Phoenix, while another aircraft had already departed Phoenix as Flight 2482. In other words, there were now two aircraft in the system with the same operational identity. Two aircraft, one flight number, one radio call sign, and, critically, both eventually entered the same area of air traffic control. This is where the story becomes much more serious. For passengers looking at a flight tracking app, seeing American 2482 might not seem unusual. But for an air traffic controller, the call sign is an important part of identifying an aircraft. When a controller says, American 2482, descend, the crew needs to know that the instruction is meant for them. Now imagine two different aircraft hearing exactly the same thing. If both pilots respond, or if one aircraft mistakenly acts on an instruction intended for the other, the consequences could be extremely serious. That is why duplicate call signs are considered a significant operational hazard. And near Phoenix, the two American 2482s were not simply sitting far apart. Their flight paths were converging. The arriving 737 was descending through roughly 11,000 feet. The departing 737 was climbing through roughly 9,000 feet. At one point, tracking data showed the aircraft separated by only around 3 miles horizontally and about 2,000 feet vertically. Now, it is important to make one thing absolutely clear. This was not a confirmed mid-air collision or a confirmed loss of separation event. The required separation was maintained. There is also no indication that either aircraft received a task resolution advisory telling the pilots to make an immediate collision avoidance maneuver. But the situation created the potential for a much more serious problem. The key word here is identification. The controller had to make absolutely certain that every instruction was going to the correct aircraft. And this is where the controller's actions became critical. Rather than simply addressing both aircraft as American 2482, the controller differentiated between them. One was identified as the American 2482 on the arrival. The other was identified as the American 2482 on the departure. The controller also used altitude restrictions and traffic information to maintain separation. The departing aircraft remained around 9,000 feet, while the arriving aircraft remained above it. Eventually, both crews were able to identify the other aircraft visually. The immediate danger was therefore contained. But there is a bigger question. How did this happen in the first place? Aviation has multiple layers of protection designed to catch exactly this kind of problem. The first layer is airline scheduling. When a flight becomes severely delayed, the airline's operational teams know that the original aircraft may no longer be able to operate the next scheduled sector. The second layer is aircraft substitution. If another aircraft is assigned to operate the flight, the airline's systems and dispatch operation have to make sure that the new aircraft is correctly associated with the flight plan. The third layer involves flight planning and ATC coordination. If two aircraft are going to be operating simultaneously with the same call sign in the same geographical area, one should be given a different operational identifier. That is the important distinction here. The commercial flight number seen by passengers does not necessarily have to be the same identifier used on the radio. An airline can use an alternative call sign or identifier to prevent two aircraft from sounding identical to ATC. But in this case, that protection apparently did not prevent the two aircraft from entering the same airspace using American 2482. And that means several safety layers either did not detect the conflict early enough or did not prevent it. The final layer was the controller, and the controller caught it. That is perhaps the most reassuring part of this entire story. The system ultimately worked because a human being recognized an unusual situation and managed it before it developed into a genuine separation problem. According to reports, The controller involved had around 25 years of experience and said he had never encountered a situation in which two aircraft with the same call sign essentially converged like this. That tells us just how unusual the event was. But it also raises a much bigger aviation safety question. Should the system depend on an experienced controller noticing the problem? Or should the airline and ATC systems automatically prevent two aircraft from using the same call sign when they are likely to occupy the same airspace? That is likely to be one of the important questions as the investigation continues. Because the individual events leading to this situation were not necessarily dangerous on their own. A flight being delayed is normal. An airline substituting another aircraft is normal. Using the same flight number for the outbound and return sectors is normal. But combine those three things together, and you can create a completely different risk. This is a classic example of how aviation accidents and incidents can develop. It isn't always one catastrophic mistake. Sometimes it is several individually harmless decisions lining up in exactly the wrong way. In this case, the delayed inbound aircraft created the first condition. The replacement aircraft created the second. The unchanged call sign created the third. And the convergence of the two aircraft exposed the vulnerability. Fortunately, the final safety barrier, the air traffic controller and flight crews, worked. The two aircraft remained separated. There was no collision. There was no confirmed loss of required separation. And the situation ended safely. But this incident is still important because it exposes a weakness that could potentially affect other airlines and other flight numbers whenever severe delays, aircraft substitutions, and tightly packed airspace occur together. The real lesson from American Airlines Flight 2482 is therefore not that two airplanes nearly collided. That would overstate what the available evidence shows. The more accurate lesson is this. A routine airline scheduling practice was combined with an unusual operational disruption, producing two aircraft with the same ATC identity in the same area. And for a brief period, the controller had to solve a problem that ideally should have been prevented before the aircraft ever got there. The FAA and American Airlines are investigating the circumstances. And the most important question isn't simply, why did the controller have two American 2482s? It's this. Why did the earlier safety systems allow two American 2482s to reach the same airspace in the first place? Because answering that question could help make sure that the next duplicate call sign isn't discovered when two aircraft are already converging, but several steps earlier, while the aircraft are still on the ground. And that is what makes this seemingly simple flight number mix-up a fascinating aviation safety story. The full actual ATC conversation with pilots of both aircrafts is already published and can be checked out here.
American 2482, the arrival at a 11,000, traffic south of your position, less than a mile, level at 9,000. American 2482, the arrival. We're going to put in an MRI. That's the first time I've been working air traffic for 25 years. I've never seen two aircraft pretty much merge with the same call sign. That's pretty incredible.